This is the You Ask, the Pros Answer podcast. Do you have questions about an upcoming exterior contracting project? We've got answers. Welcome to the You Ask, the Pros Answer podcast. Hey, welcome to the You Ask, the Pros Answer podcast. Your questions answered by the pros you trust. It's Cole and Aaron here again with you. Aaron, how are you doing today?
It's a little wet outside, so yeah, I'm wet.
You guys getting any of that ice that my family's getting in Baltimore?
I think it's coming. I don't think it's here yet, but I know next week looks pretty dreary.
Yeah, so I'm wearing my Orioles hat because the Ravens did not make it. Super Bowl is this weekend. Aaron, I know you are a huge NFL fan.
I mean, all sports, Cole. Don't just limit all sports. You know, I have teams for every league. Sport. I love sports in general.
So here we sit,
sports.
2 days before the biggest NFL game of the year, and I thought we would start by picking the score for the game, and then future selves can figure out how close we each got. So I don't want to make any assumptions, but that you know who's playing. Do you know who's in the Super Bowl?
Of course. And like I said, I'm a huge sports fan.
Okay.
So it's the Eagles and the Chiefs.
Yes, it is.
Look at that. Told you.
Eagles of Philadelphia and the Chiefs of Kansas City. So in Super Bowl history, there's never been a three-time champion consecutively. The Chiefs have won the last 2 Super Bowls in a row. According to DraftKings, I don't even know what this means. The spread is Chiefs minus 1.5, and the over-under is 48.5. Again, I've never fully understood what those numbers mean. But with that said, you and I are each going to choose a score.
Okay.
I'm going to write it down, and then we'll come back here and we'll crown our own little Super Bowl champions. So, would you like to go first?
Sure. I will do. I'm going to go. Man, that's tough. Let's go 27-21 Chiefs.
So you're going for the three-peat, huh?
I think it's possible. I mean, if you go by the conspiracy theories, it's all rigged anyway. So
yeah, yep. All right, I'm going to, just to play devil's advocate, I'm going to go. I want to go for the upset. I want to say Eagles 31, Chiefs 29.
Wow. Okay.
Now, more importantly, we're going to choose the amount of screen time that Taylor Swift gets during the Super Bowl broadcast.
Okay.
Now, here's the deal. Businesses are spending millions of dollars for advertising, and she's going to get screen time for free.
Oh, free.
I'm going to say she gets a total of 3.5 minutes of screen time. That's a lot.
Yeah. I'm going to go 2 minutes, 40 seconds.
All right. I'm assuming there'll be some outlet that'll
has to be
pick that up.
Has to be.
All right. If you are watching this, would you drop your prediction in the comments? We want to see who wins. Maybe the winner will get, I'm making this up on the spot. We haven't talked to our legal department, but the winner of either prediction will get a You Ask the Pros Answer podcast sticker.
And maybe a koozie.
And maybe a koozie.
Maybe
we'll make the
cool swag.
We'll make the shipping worth it because it'll cost more than the sticker. Yeah. All right. Aaron, the last few weeks we have done this mini how-to series where we have walked through a couple of the different services that we provide and provided kind of a DIY instruction guide on how to replace windows, how to replace siding, roof. And it's not, again, it's not meant to train our crews. Really, we're not going that in depth. It's really just to let the homeowner know what all goes into a project.
Yeah.
And I thought, as I don't know, I'm looking out my window, it's pretty dreary, but I'm willing it to be warmer outside, and that means deck season will be here before we know it.
Right around the corner.
Right around the corner. I would like for us to discuss what it takes to build a deck. So the question today is, how do you build a deck? What is the very first thing in that process?
Ooh. So very first thing would be, can you build a deck? So first thing you want to do is, before you go through the whole process of, getting estimates and all that stuff, is to find out if you're even allowed to. We live in an area that has a lot of communities. Communities typically come with HOAs and COAs and bylaws and rules and all that kind of stuff. So the first thing to do would be to figure out if you even can build a deck. A lot of times you're gonna need a plot plan, which, depending on, again, if you live in a community, you should have received a plot plan when you bought the house. Your plot plan will tell you your building restriction lines. If you live outside of a community and you just have like county restrictions, then again, you just need to figure out, do you have the actual ability to build a deck without kind of going over your property lines. So once you do that, obviously you're going to call a contractor. Contractor's going to come out, measure the space, figure out exactly what needs to be done. Decks, we kind of build two different ways. We build ones that are basically attached to the residence, and we build ones that are called freestanding decks that are not technically attached. They look like they're attached, but they actually have no, the house itself doesn't actually physically support the deck at all.
Is there a reason why you would choose one over the other?
So sometimes it's going to depend on how the existing house was built. Some building materials, the common thing is to kind of just throw the ledger board, which is the board that we actually fasten to the house. Some people they'll throw it up and just kind of bolt it to the existing rim board. Depending on the size of the deck, that's not always sufficient. So, you have the ability, if you build a large enough deck. We've had a lot of issues over the last say 10 years or so with kind of like decks pulling away from houses and people being hurt. So deck codes have changed a lot over the last 10 years. So we have different ways that we're now required to kind of secure things to the house or not. And then sometimes you just get into a situation like we have a lot of like manufactured home communities here. Manufactured homes may or may not have a actual foundation underneath of them. So houses that don't have a foundation, like when you're adding that existing load to the side of the property, you can secure it to there, but there's not really a foundation wall underneath of that. So typically, anytime you have like a manufactured home that doesn't have a permanent foundation, we would do a freestanding deck. So it'll look like it's attached, but if you look underneath, the actual structure is supported on its own. So,
gotcha. Okay.
So then we're going to come out, we're going to figure out, exactly what the needs are, what type of deck you need. If we have the room to build it, obviously we'll kind of, we'll go ahead and talk about like rough layout plans, what you need, stairs, all those kind of requirements. There's certain codes that we have to stick by when it comes to decks. Decks 30 inches and above require like additional inspections. Decks 30 inches and below, or below 30 inches, do not require the same level of inspections. But, and this is a big but, they still both require a permit. So any contractor that you meet with, if they tell you, hey, your deck's under 30 inches, you don't need a permit, you still need a permit. The only difference is normally with a deck, you're going to get a footer inspection, a framing inspection, and a final inspection. With a deck that's under 30 inches, you only technically get a final inspection. And that's more so, they're really and truly looking for just to make sure that deck is under that 30-inch mark. 30-inch decks don't require railings per code, but I will tell you that if you have a deck that's 29 inches tall and you step off that thing the wrong way, 29 inches is a lot larger than people think. So So then you're going to figure out, how tall is the deck going to be, and then depending on what your next step is, depends on whether or not you need plans. Depending on where you're at, you may or may not need like actual stamped engineer plans. We pretty much draw all of our plans here in house. We've done full additions and everything without having to get stamped plans. So Sussex County tends to be fairly lax on some of those things. So figure out what you need, and then we're going to draw plans based upon those needs. And then, if it all gets approved, then we're going to go and get permits. You need a couple of different approvals. If you live in a community, you're going to have to get your HOA approval first. You need the HOA approval to get your town permit, and then you need your town permit to get your county permit.
Okay.
And then right prior to starting your deck, you're going to call Miss Utility, or some people just know it as 811. Call before you dig. So they're going to come out and they're going to mark all the underground utility lines. So water lines, power lines, phone lines, internet, whatever it may be. They're going to come out and they're going to mark the ground to make sure in the process of digging our footers, we don't actually hit any of those lines. I am going to say that I'm going to be honest with you. We don't always do that. We do it on most jobs, but we don't always do that. There are some times where we're so confident in the fact that there's going to be nothing in this area that we don't do it. And I will say, in my 20 years, and I'm going to knock on wood as I say this, in my 20 years of building decks, I will say that there's only been one time that I've ever actually struck an underground line, and it was not marked. I did actually call Miss Utility on that one, and that line was not marked. So not technically my fault, luckily, because I didn't get in trouble for that one. So, so then you're going to dig your footers. Like I said, if you get, depending on your permits, next you would get your footers inspected, and then you'll start your framing. Framing, it depends on what product you're using, depends on how you frame. And then once framing is done, you go in and you'll put in your decking, your trim. Once decking and trim is done, then you're going to go in and you're going to put on your railings. And then your final little pieces of the puzzle is like your finishing touches up against the house. Depending on your siding, you may have to put in additional trim. Any deck that is over 4 stair risers now requires an ADA handrail. We used to be able to get away with anything that was considered graspable. Railings that were like 3 1/4 inches or less in width used to be considered a graspable handrail. But now every deck that has over 4 stair rises has to have an ADA handrail. So those are the things that most people usually forget. The graspable handrails, kind of a dumb little thing. I personally don't think it's needed, but I don't make the codes. So, and then when you're all said and done, when you have all your finishing touches put on there, then you're going to call for your final inspection, and they're going to come out and they're going to look at a couple of different things. Normally your framing, you can get your framing inspection and your final inspection for a deck at the same time. So they're going to come out and they're going to look at to make sure the framing is properly sized. They're going to make sure that everything matches the actual drawn plans that were stamped by the county. They're going to come and they're going to look at, make sure your fasteners are proper. They're going to look at how it was fastened to the house. They're going to look at, are all of your metal hangers and connectors and post bases and all that stuff, are they properly nailed or screwed off? Do your stair risers match in size? You're only allowed a 3/8 of an inch variance between your stair risers. So sometimes the bottom step, even though it's technically supposed to be the same side, if you don't have like a pad for that to land on, time you put dirt and stuff around that bottom step, sometimes it can grow or shrink a little bit.
Sure.
And then they'll make sure like your railing heights and stuff are the proper height, 36 or 42, depending on your area. But yeah, and then it's just a matter of cleaning up.
I want to go back to the framing portion of it. Could you talk about some of the considerations that are given to either the material or even the spacing between joists?
Yeah.
On the deck.
Yeah. So when you're framing for a deck, the first thing we look at is going to be the span of the deck. So the size of the deck depends on what size lumber you need. So you have minimum codes that tell you, let's say for instance, a 2x8 if the joists are 16 inches on center, you can span, let's say, 10 feet or less. If you're to do that same thing with a 2x10, you can go 12, almost 13 feet, I think it is. But if you were to take 2x8s and you were to put them 12 inches on center, you can actually span a little bit more because you're kind of carrying that load differently. Again, that's minimum code. We try to build every deck above code because minimum code, if you span it to the maximum amount, your deck is going to bounce. So as you're walking across it, you'll feel the deck actually move. And we try to build decks that don't bounce. And then, you're also going to come into consideration of what type of decking material you're putting on there. Standard pressure treated decking, standard cap composite decking. Some people have used other things like cedar or ipe. I've seen people use actual 2x6s for decking. Those things you have no issue whatsoever doing 16 inches on center. But if you're going to do kind of a higher end deck, or if you want a deck that's super strong, or you're using like PVC decking, you're going to have to do everything 12 inches on center. The only time you don't even have to think about it is all stairs. Your stair stringers have to be 12 inches on center per code. So there's no thinking in regards to that. They have to be 12 inches on center. But yeah, and then like you can get into like certain situations where if you want to use, say, a 2x10 lumber, but you're going to span way over, then you would just have to add in like a supplement beam underneath to kind of carry that additional span. And then we look at things like, do we use 4x4 post? Do we use 6x6 post for the actual support of the deck? Mm-hmm. A lot of times, most of the times, we'll use 4x4s. 6x6s is usually if it's above a certain height off the ground, we'll use a 6x6 because it has a little bit more support. And we'll use 6x6s for our support beams because we like to notch our beams in so the load carries all the way down to the footer and it's not just held in by bolts.
Gotcha.
We also like one of the areas where there tends to be a lot of failure is the ledger board. Again, that's the board that attaches to the house. That tends to be the spot where most people fail at. There can be a lot of rot behind that. So the proper way to do that is to have like ledger flashing behind there, not only behind the actual board, but also above it. So, we treat it just like everything else where we want water to kind of shed from top to bottom and be able to kind of get its way out. So we'll do like a leak barrier or ice and water shield behind the ledger board prior to actually attaching the ledger board. They do also, there's a couple of companies out there that make these deck spacers that allow like any potential water that does happen to get behind there. These spacers have a gap between the ledger board and the house so that any water that gets back there can kind of flow on out. And then once we attach the ledger board, again, it 100% depends on how your house is built and what we have to actually attach to. Sometimes we can get away with just doing bolts. We stagger our bolts 16 inches on center or 12 inches on center, depending on how we frame. So sometimes you can get away with simply attaching the ledger board that way. Other times you'll have to do some kind of like lateral bolts. There's these brackets that go on the actual joists, and there's a bolt that goes inside. There'll be a joist on the inside for your framing that you kind of have a bolt that goes between, and you kind of tighten it down. Not every deck requires those, but it's becoming more and more common that we're installing those. So, but yeah, I mean that's pretty much most of the framing details that you would deal with. And then you have a whole bunch of like metal hangers and straps and stuff that we're required to use. But I mean, I think that's pretty standard. I think most people know that, I would assume.
I don't know if I'd assume. But I think my only other question would be, and we've answered this with all of our other how-tos, is how long does a deck project take? Understanding that there's many variables, no two decks are the same, but a typical deck, how long is that project?
Let's say that a standard deck is probably 12 foot by 12 foot. If it's done properly, a week.
Okay.
Yeah. A 12 by 12 deck should never take, if it's just a deck, it should never take more than a week.
And that's just the construction though, right? That does not take into consideration pulling permits, that kind of
Yeah,
stuff. It's the
permits is one of
on-site.
those things. If you have to get HOA approval, you can assume that HOA approval can take 30 days, sometimes more. We've been in the situations where some HOAs only meet once a month. So if you miss last month's meeting,
Yep.
you may not be able to get onto, may not be able to even get the stuff looked at for 30 days.
Yeah.
And then a lot of them, dude, there's one down in Selbyville that I can think of that's got a property manager that's kind of like a national company. And their policy states that you have to have everything submitted 14 business days prior to the HOA meeting in order to get on to that meeting schedule.
Yikes.
So, I mean, you could be 45 days before you even get stuff looked at pretty easily if it's not timed properly. And, you know, if you go into that HOA meeting and they look at something and they have additional questions or they need more paperwork, you know, you may get pushed to the following month before it gets reviewed again. So, yeah, so that's probably the most tedious part. And then most of the time, most townships in the county, you can usually walk in and walk out. If it's a deck under 30 inches, you're going to get that permit right on the spot. If you have to have plans and you have to have plan review, usually less than 2 weeks. Yeah, pretty much almost every town we deal with the exception of like Rehoboth, is pretty much 2 weeks or less. So
listener, if you're watching this and it is right around the time that this episode comes out and you're thinking that this spring you would love to have a new deck, don't feel like, oh, well, it's still middle of winter. Like, get started now. Give us a call now and get the ball rolling, as they say.
Yep.
All right, Aaron, thanks for your information and your knowledge. We'll check back here in a couple weeks and see who won the NFL guessing game. I don't have a name for that. All right. Thank you. All right, everybody. That's all that we have for you today on the You Ask the Pros Answer podcast. Would you please help us get the word out about the show? The best way to do that is to leave reviews on Apple Podcasts, follow us on social media, or simply tell a friend. Also, I'm going to ask if you can do a favor for us. If you are watching on YouTube, would you please like this video and click that subscribe button on the channel? Also, before we go, we want to hear from you. We know that this show does not exist without your questions. What questions do you have about upcoming home remodeling projects? Would you please send those to info@askproexteriors.com, and then in the subject line, simply put You Ask. We hope this episode has empowered you to tackle your next project with confidence. Remember, knowledge is power, and a little bit of research can go a long way. Until next time, go Eagles, and happy homeowning. The You Ask the Pros Answer podcast is produced in-house by the Pro Exteriors team. Pro Exteriors is the exterior contracting division of Empire Construction Group, LLC. This podcast is intended for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal advice. For more answers to your questions, please subscribe to this channel and podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Do you have an upcoming home remodeling project? Find more answers to your questions at askproexteriors.com.